All right, so let's get started with a word of prayer. Dear Lord, I pray that you be with us today. I pray that you would give me clarity of thought, Lord. Help me to clearly explain your word to your church here, Lord. I pray that you would help us all to understand what is clearly intended for us, Lord. I pray that you would help all of us to have open hearts and minds to hear your word today. I pray that I would have the words to speak to people, Lord. Help it to be clear and accurate. And I pray that you would receive glory and honor today, Lord. And I thank you for this church that could gather together in obedience to your word, Lord. I pray all this in Jesus' name. Amen. Excuse me. All right. So today we're going to go over the fourth commandment, the Sabbath. It's week 7. We're doing good. We're still on schedule. We've still got quite a ways to go, so this is good. I think I've been enjoying the class. I think a lot of you have too. So let's get right into it. So this week, we're going to talk about the Sabbath, which is, I think, a pretty poorly understood commandment. It's somewhat simple in application, really, but it's very misunderstood, I would say. I've received a lot of feedback from you. I think this is a really good topic to go over. So let's get right into it. Exodus 20, verses 8 through 11, excuse me, is the commandment here. Let me read it to you. You can turn there, Exodus 20, 8 through 11. Remember the Sabbath day to keep it holy. 6 days shalt thou labor and do all thy work. But the 7th day is the Sabbath of the Lord thy God. In it thou shalt not do any work, thou, nor thy son, nor thy daughter, thy manservant, nor thy maidservant, nor thy cattle, nor thy stranger that is within thy gates. For in 6 days the Lord made heaven and earth, the sea and all that in them is, and rested the 7th day. Wherefore the Lord blessed the Sabbath day and hallowed it. All right, so that's the text of the command, but I think it's important to make a distinction here between the types of Sabbaths and determine which of them, if any, applies to us. And which of them are in view here in this commandment. So throughout the Old Testament, I found 3 types of Sabbaths that excuse me, 3 types of Sabbaths that are described. There's firstly the weekly day of rest. This is the most common one. This is the one we're going to talk about today, and this is the most basic, most well understood Sabbath. There's also the special Sabbaths that were part of temple worship. So all throughout the Old Testament, in Leviticus, Deuteronomy, Exodus, and Numbers, and various places, you will read these commandments where it says, you shall do this sacrifice on this Sabbath. You shall have this feast day on this Sabbath. You will have this high holy day and this Sabbath associated with it, and vice versa, and so on and so forth. There are so many, and they don't fall on Saturdays or Sundays necessarily. They're sometimes random days of the week. They follow the moon in some cases. They follow strict schedules in certain cases. The point is they don't necessarily follow a weekly schedule. They're not regular weekly things like the Sabbath we think about today or back then. These are invariably, all of these Sabbaths, we should understand that they were special days given to the Jews. They started with the Jews and they ended with the Jews because their purpose was to point to Christ. All of these special holy days, if you had taken my other class, I showed you that there are special holy days that are very specifically designed to point to Christ and that Christ fulfilled during his death and resurrection. Those holy days are done away with. Those Sabbaths are done away with. And I think we understand that they are done away with. And that's not even what we're going to talk about in this class. So this class is going to be very narrowly focused on just the weekly Sabbath. There's also the 7th year Sabbath for the land's sake. So this one, I'm just going to briefly describe this to you. This comes from Leviticus 25, verses 1 through 4. Let me read that to get this going. And the Lord spake unto Moses in Mount Sinai, saying, Speak unto the children of Israel, and say unto them, When ye come into the land which I give you, then shall the land keep a Sabbath unto the Lord. The land keeps a Sabbath, which is interesting. 6 years shalt thou sow thy field, and 6 years thou shalt prune thy vineyard, and gather in the fruit thereof. But in the 7th year shall be a Sabbath of shall be a Sabbath of rest unto the land, a Sabbath for the Lord. Thou shalt neither sow thy field nor prune thy vineyard. Then if you continue reading in that chapter, verses 20 through 22, you'll read that this form of Sabbath was supported by miracles on the 6th year. It says this, And if ye shall say, What shall we eat the 7th year? Behold, we shall not sow nor gather in our increase. Then I will command my blessing upon you in the 6th year, and it shall bring forth fruit for 3 years. And ye shall sow the 8th year, and eat the yield, and eat yet of old fruit until the 9th year, until her fruit come in, ye shall eat of the old store. So basically, the 7th year was a whole year where you shouldn't plant or reap. And to allow them to survive that year, God would make the 6th year extremely fruitful. So this was very clearly a supernatural event. And this was very clearly a special thing for Israel, since it only happens in Israel. It doesn't happen anymore, in fact. Very importantly, I would say, it doesn't happen. So there are some, I've heard it argued that there are some who suggest that this 1 year of rest was designed to help rejuvenate the soil in a strictly naturalistic way. There's no miracles involved here. It's just that the mere fact of doing this type of crop rotation helped the soil accept more nutrients and bring forth more fruit in a very normal way. And these miracles that are supposedly stated here in Leviticus wouldn't really happen. It was just a natural thing that they learned to do. This is the kind of the same argument that you'll hear where the reason why Jews were told not to eat pigs was because pigs were very dirty animals. They're very susceptible to a lot of different viruses and bacteria that are very easily transmitted to people. So simply having no pigs was just God's way of slowly introducing them into a more civilized society. And now that we are in a very civilized society and we know how to cook pork and we know how to raise pigs, all that's done away with. These are basically naturalistic arguments. This is somewhat close to moral relativism, where we said that, yes, they did a thing in the olden days, but now that we understand better, we can change our morality, and now we can do those things that they didn't do back then. This is simply wrong. These Sabbaths were supported by actual miracles, and miracles on the year you wouldn't expect. If this was a naturalistic thing that God was just hinting at through these commandments, you would expect more fruit on the 1st year, not on the 6th year. You would actually expect the opposite of what you would see from these miracles. So all this to say that this 7th year of rest was supported by miracles that do not happen today. And these were miracles and a rest that was only supposed to start as soon as the Jews entered into the land. And it was supposed to end when Judaism essentially was done away with. Judaism as a religion, anyway. So all that to say, we're not going to talk about this year of rest. This is a very interesting and unique Sabbath. It has a distinct start point and a distinct end point. The command is not repeated anywhere in the New Testament. The text of the command in Exodus only mentions days and not years. And the miracle of the 6th year bountiful harvest doesn't occur anymore. So this leads me to believe that this type of Sabbath was specifically for Israel to create a distinction from the Gentiles and to signal supernaturally that Israel, both the people and the land, belongs to God. So today, we're only going to talk about, the long and short of it is, we're only going to talk about the weekly repeated Sabbath, the weekly day of rest, the first one on the list. So we're not going to talk about the special Sabbaths as part of Jewish worship. We're not going to talk about the 7-year Sabbath, just the weekly Sabbath. So last week I gave you these handouts, these questions. And these were designed to make you think. And a lot of you did a lot of thinking, so they definitely worked. So what do you all think about this? Is anyone willing to raise their hands? Who thinks, does the Sabbath apply to Christians today? Who thinks it does not apply to us? If If you have the courage, raise your hand. Okay. Who thinks B, it does apply to us? Raise your hand. Okay. Who thinks C? I know at least some of you said C. Oh, we got C. A couple of you did put C. You couldn't get it. That's all right. It's perfectly fine. And then I had this follow-up question. Which day is the Sabbath for us today? And I mean the weekly Sabbath. Which one was it? So A, it doesn't apply to us. Who thinks that? Some of you already answered it for the other one. That's fine. So who thinks it's Saturday? Okay. Who thinks it's Sunday? Okay. Who thinks it's any day of the week? Any day that you pick. All right. And then who just is too lazy to admit it? Who just wants to see every day? I want it to be every day. That should have been an option. All right. So let's go right into it. So to be able to answer these questions, we need to understand, if the Sabbath applies to us and how it applies to us if it does, we first need to know its purpose and meanings and how it was practiced by the Jews in the Old Testament and by the New Testament Christians. So the command itself, let's just remember it. It's to remember the Sabbath, to keep it holy. And there are several components of the Sabbath that we're going to look at today. First, we're going to look at the weekly day of rest from work. So back in focus of just the weekly Sabbath, so the weekly day of rest. Most people, even in the non-Jewish world today, have a weekend, and this is where the weekend comes from. So on Saturday, when you don't have to go to work, you should literally thank God for that. Also Sunday, when you don't go to work, you should literally thank God for that. So also there is within the week, there is the idea of, within the Sabbath, the weekly Sabbath, there's the idea of separating one day for God. So rest from work for a day, separating one day for God, and a distinction and identification of God's people. All three of these things are found in the Sabbath, the weekly Sabbath, in the Old Testament and in the New Testament. And if we understand how it applied to the Jews in the Old Testament, you will better understand how it applies to us in the New Testament and why they're different. So I guess that's a little hint for the answer. So let's look at the first aspect of this command, the rest from work. So the text says, remember the Sabbath day to keep it holy. 6 days shalt thou labor and do all thy work, but in the seventh day is the Sabbath of the Lord thy God. In it thou shalt not do any work, thou, nor thy son, nor thy daughter, thy manservant, nor thy maidservant, thy cattle, nor thy stranger that is within thy gates. For in 6 days the Lord made heaven and earth, the sea and all that in them is, and rested the seventh day. Wherefore the Lord blessed the Sabbath day and hallowed it. So kind of a definition of the rest part of the Sabbath is simply setting aside one day of the week to rest from our labor. This is the most commonly understood meaning for the Sabbath. It's a day of the week where we are not supposed to labor for ourselves. We are to rest. And I would say, just like last lesson where I said some people go too far with taking the Lord's name in vain, they simply never speak his name, you can go too far with this also. And the Jews very commonly did that. And it's highlighted for us in the New Testament all over the place. And when Jesus explained things about the Sabbath to them, he was peeling back those layers of extremism that they had put on there. So the obvious next question is, what is rest? What does it mean to rest? And I think the best answer is it varies from person to person. And it may depend on the type of labor you commonly do. But it at least involves the lack of serious physical labor for yourself. We get this from plenty of places in the Old Testament. And this is why it always says rest from labor. Back in the old days, there was only one type of labor you were doing. If you had a job, you were laboring, like physical, hard, manual labor. And that was all you were doing. Even the Levites, even the priests, who didn't exactly plant crops. In fact, they didn't plant crops. They had no land of their own. They would do serious physical labor in the temple. So Sabbath was a rest from physical labor. A good indicator, I would say, that you are resting is that you feel refreshed. You feel rested. That's literally part of the command there. It says, anyway, so it says that you feel rested. It's that you should rest. The 6 days is for your labor. The seventh day is for rest. If you feel rested, you did a good job. You rested. It's important to note that your rest from the Sabbath is for the purpose of refreshing you after your labor, and it's not intended to be a burden on you. So the Jews very, very famously back in the Old Testament and the New Testament, actually. Today, right now, there are sects of Jews that do crazy things to extend the Sabbath, and they make it a burden on themselves. But that's not the intention of the Sabbath. It's meant to be a blessing for you, even if it might slightly inconvenience you. So sometimes there are some things about the Sabbath that do inconvenience us a little bit, but these are not burdens. This is not a burden. We've all been there. It's a sad situation. You go to Poland on a Sunday. But that's not a burden. That's a slight inconvenience. And it's a good thing that they're doing that. So let me read Exodus 23:12 for you. It says this: 6 days shalt thou do thy work, and on the seventh day thou shalt rest, that thine ox and thine ass may rest, and that the son of thy handmaid and the stranger may be refreshed. So that's the verse I was looking for. The point of resting is to be refreshed. That's a core component of the Sabbath here. And this is why Jesus explains in Mark 2:27 and Matthew 12 that the Sabbath was made for man and not the other way around. It's supposed to be a blessing for you. From the very beginning, when God rested on the seventh day, he blessed it and made it sacred, and it was a good thing for us. Ultra-Orthodox Jews and Chick-fil-A have extremely strict, maybe not Chick-fil-A, have extremely strict rules about how they followed the Sabbath, and they go way too far. They have rules for not using electricity for some reason because they believe that it falls in the same category as kindling a fire, which was prohibited in Exodus 35. So Exodus 35:3 says, "Ye shall kindle no fire throughout your habitations upon the Sabbath day." They have taken this to mean that electricity works the same as fire. It's the same modern day equivalent as kindling a fire. So they can't switch lights on or off. I don't know why not off, but they can't switch lights on or off. They have you can't get in an elevator. You can't run an elevator on the Sabbath day. So they have all sorts of weird ways around this. They have things called the Sabbath elevator, which a lot of buildings, high rises and so forth, or if you can't go upstairs, you need an elevator. So what do you do if you're a Jew? You just stay in your house all day long and just rot there. Some of them do. But what they have are special Sabbath elevators that run automatically. They stop on every floor, and they just run all day long and all night long. Instead of you getting in and pushing a button, the elevator just kind of appears on your floor. And that's convenient. I'll just get in. And look, it appeared on the floor I'm going to also. So you just get out. So totally ruins the spirit of the Sabbath. If you're not allowed to flip a light switch, you're not allowed to use an elevator. That's just ridiculous. I honestly question what they think about God in those cases. Is God really looking down and saying, "Oh yes, that's what I meant when I said don't kindle a fire. I meant you're not allowed to push the button for your floor on the elevator." No, this is ridiculousness. There's a very common practice. If you go to certain areas like in New York City that have a very dense concentration of very strict Jews, you will sometimes see this. I've never seen it, but I've heard, obviously you don't live in New York, but I've heard this is a pretty common thing where you walk by Jewish areas and Jews will stand in their doorway watching Gentiles walk by. They'll yell at them and ask them if they can come in their house and turn off some lights for them. It's a very weird thing. These Jews are just like, you think about it, the Jews sitting there, I hope the Gentile walks by. I need my light turned off because I can't do it for the Sabbath. So if you forgot to turn off your bedroom light, for example, on Friday before Sabbath, you're either going to sleep in broad daylight in the light in your bedroom, or you're going to ask a Gentile to come in and turn it off for you. It's a really weird situation. They have a very different view of Gentiles than we do, than we would expect them to from the Old Testament. And but yes, if they're gonna strictly apply it, then no one should be able to do any work, including the Gentiles. Yes, if you're roping in a Gentile to break the Sabbath, you're just causing them to sin. That's not right. They're very silly. So I think, so this verse specifically, let's address this verse in Exodus where it says, don't kindle a fire. I think this verse is better understood to mean that kindling a fire was a very difficult thing to do if you didn't already have one going. So if you're going to go start a fire from nothing and you don't have a lighter, that's tough. I mean, we've tried to do it camping, and we even have, I've never done it. I've used like the flint and steel type method, which is semi-easy. You get it going the right way. It's not super hard, but they didn't have flint and steel back then. If you're going to start a fire, it's an ordeal. It's really tough. It's real labor. So I don't know how stupid they think God is, but they act like he's stupid, and it's unfortunate. It's not the right way to look at the Sabbath. All right, so let's continue on. So examples in the New Testament of the proper way to rest from work. So let's look at Jesus. So Jesus in the New Testament. You can turn to Matthew 12 if you'd like. Matthew 12, 1 through 13. So we're going to read an example of how Jesus viewed the Sabbath. So Matthew 12, 1 through 13. It says, "At that time, Jesus went on the Sabbath day through the corn, and his disciples were an hungered, and he began to pluck the ears of corn and to eat. But when the Pharisees saw it, they said unto him, Behold, thy disciples do that which is not lawful to do upon the Sabbath day. But he said unto them, Have ye not read what David did when he was an hungered, and they that were with him, how he entered into the house of God, and did eat the showbread, which was not lawful for him to eat, neither for them which were with him, but only for the priests? Or have ye not read in the law, how that on the Sabbath days the priests in the temple profane the Sabbath, and are blameless? But I say unto you, that in this place is one greater than the temple. But if ye had known what this meaneth, I will have mercy and not sacrifice, ye would not have condemned the guiltless. For the Son of Man is Lord even of the Sabbath day. And when he was departed thence, he went into their synagogue. And behold, there was a man which had his hand withered, and they asked him, saying, Is it lawful to heal on the Sabbath days? That they might accuse him. And he said unto them, What man shall there be among you that shall have one sheep, and if it fall into a pit on the Sabbath day, will he not lay hold on it and lift it out? How much then is a man better than a sheep? Wherefore it is lawful to do well on the Sabbath days. Then saith he to the man, Stretch forth thine hand. And he stretched it forth, and it was restored whole, like as the other. So this text establishes several important facts. First, it is, and always has been, lawful to do necessary things on the Sabbath, as long as those things are not a sin. Well, I guess if it's necessary, it's not a sin. However, I think it is obvious that this should not be taken too far, and the day should primarily be used for rest and worship. So this example that God gives us is, if you need to heal someone on the Sabbath, go ahead and do it. So a modern application would be, if you're a doctor and you're on call on the Sabbath and you get a call, go heal them. That's a perfectly fine, it's not a violation of the Sabbath, it's allowed in the Sabbath. If you have an animal who, a sheep in this case, falls into a pit, go save your sheep. But what really is a sheep to you? It's not that much. Honestly, if a sheep dies, it's a sheep. It's not great, but it's not too bad either. God uses that as an example. You would do that on the Sabbath, a simple task to save your sheep, even though it would be technically a violation of all the laws you've added onto the Sabbath. But Jesus says that was the intent from the beginning. The intent from the beginning was for it to not be a burden on you. It's supposed to be a time for you to rest. But if you need to do something, you are allowed to do that. It's not a strict, here are the set of things you cannot do. You cannot flip a light switch on. No. If going down to the stairs, opening your front door, waiting for a Gentile to walk by, and convincing the Gentile to come in and flip your switch, that's a lot more work than just flipping the switch. The idea is the rest is not supposed to be a burden on you. It's supposed to be something for your benefit. And so Jesus lays that out pretty well, I think. The command to rest should not become a burden to you like it is and was for the Jews. However, it is still a command. You are supposed to rest, and you should be refreshed after the Sabbath. So another example of resting on the Sabbath is creation. So this is the best and most important example. This is the first Sabbath. This establishes that the Sabbath existed before the law, which is a key part of this. And this even suggests that the Sabbath existed before sin, which is an interesting concept. Let's read Genesis 2, 1 through 3. Thus the heavens and the earth were finished, and all the host of them. And on the seventh day God ended his work which he had made, and he rested on the seventh day from all his work which he had made. And God blessed the seventh day and sanctified it, because that in it he had rested from all his work, which God created and made. So this is the original Sabbath, and it involved rest from work and a blessing of the day and a sanctification of the day. It's the pattern that he says you should follow this going forward. Also, this Sabbath happened long before Abraham was born and before there were any Jews for God to give a law to. Yet it was still a Sabbath. This is a strong indicator that the Sabbath was not just for the Jews. In fact, this is proof that it was not just for the Jews, since it happened before Jews even existed. This also means that the Sabbath is not done away with by Christ, unlike all the ceremonial laws and customs in the Old Testament law, which were supposed to point to him. The Sabbath, the weekly Sabbath, doesn't necessarily point to Christ, since it happened before there was even a need for Christ. Before sin, there was the Sabbath. The Sabbath applied to humanity before the Jews, and it applies to humanity after the Jews, which is kind of an answer to one of your questions. The Sabbath does in fact apply to us. So another example of the Sabbath, this is the Old Testament law. There are many, many examples in the Old Testament. We're not going to go through most of them. We're just going to go through this one in Isaiah 58. You don't need to turn there, but let me briefly describe this chapter to you. So in Isaiah 58, verses 1 through 12, God is explaining to the Jews that they have been doing the feasts and Sabbaths wrong by focusing on themselves and their works during those Sabbaths. And then in verses 13 and 14, God corrects them and tells them that if they would instead focus on him on the Sabbaths, they would have had delight in God and he would have blessed them. So let me read verses 13 and 14 to you for sake of time. Isaiah 58, 13 and 14. If thou turn away thy foot from the Sabbath, from doing thy pleasure on my holy day, and call the Sabbath a delight, the holy of the Lord. Sorry, let me read that to you. If thou turn away thy foot from the Sabbath, from doing thy pleasure on my holy day, and call the Sabbath a delight, the holy of the Lord, honorable, and shall honor him, not doing thine own ways, nor finding thine own pleasure, nor speaking thine own words, then shalt thou delight thyself in the Lord, and I will cause thee to ride upon the high places of the earth, and feed thee with the heritage of Jacob thy father, for the mouth of the Lord hath spoken it. So, from the beginning, the Sabbath was supposed to force them to keep their focus on God by forbidding them from doing their own work and their own pleasure. They are supposed to seek God and not themselves on the Sabbath day. On the Sabbath day. That's an important thing. It's not just it's kind of transitions into the next point, but it wasn't supposed to be just a day for rest. It was supposed to be a day for rest, but it had the additional meaning of it's God's day, and you're supposed to honor God and seek God on that day. So that brings us right to the next point. The fourth commandment, the Sabbath, was supposed to be a day for God. And what do I mean by this? Setting aside a single day of the week for the specific purpose of worshiping God. So I think we've established that, yes, the Sabbath does apply to us, because it applied to everyone, even before the Jews, and was not done away with. But now let's talk about what this part of the Sabbath means. A day for God. Setting aside a single day of the week for the specific purpose of worshiping God on that day. One day of the week, of every week, is supposed to be a day specifically dedicated to God and primarily used for that purpose. So in Exodus 20, if you look back there on the commandment, if you notice the phrasing in verse 10, it is the Sabbath of the Lord God. It is supposed to be a day that belongs to him. This is repeated in Isaiah where it says, this is my holy day that you are supposed to observe his ways. It's supposed to be in stark contrast with the other days that are belonging to us. The other 6 days are for our labor. This one day is for God's labor. Very few people, I would say, including Christians, follow this command with proper dedication and respect. Most do not put much effort into this command. In fact, many so-called Christians ignore it completely because it has the implication of requiring you to go to church on Sunday. Nevertheless, it is important that we remember that this command carries the same weight as thou shalt not kill. So if you believe that thou shalt not kill applies to you as Christians today, why do you ignore this one? It falls in the same category. It's in the same set of 10 as all the other commandments. If you think that having no other God before you still applies to you as Christians, why wouldn't you believe this one does? Why does this one get a very strange carve-out that it no longer applies to us, yet all the other 10 do? Or the other 9, I guess, do. Let's look at some examples of this day for God. So the Levitical law. So the Old Testament spells out many ways the Jews were supposed to worship God. And the question is, was this worship supposed to occur on the Sabbath? So I used to believe that the Jews worshipped on the Sabbath for the happy accident of you have a day off. So what else are you going to do? That's not really why they worship on the Sabbath. It was a commandment for them to worship on the Sabbath. And if you read Acts 15:21, Jesus and the apostle, so you see this played out for us in the New Testament when Jesus, every week he goes into the synagogue. Why is he going into the synagogue on the Sabbath? Because that's when they worshipped. If you read Acts 15:21, it says, "For Moses of old time hath in every city them that preach him, being read in the synagogues every Sabbath day." So every Sabbath day from Moses on, they were preaching and being read the scriptures in the synagogues on the Sabbath. There's a strong tie between them, and Isaiah spells it out nicely where it says, the Sabbath is not for you, the rest is for you, but the Sabbath is God's holy day where you are supposed to worship God on that day. So it's a definitive tie-in. They are requirements both together. The rest and the worship of God are on the same day, and it's on the Sabbath. In the New Testament, we see there's a weekly assembly in the church. So before we get into the which day, we see that very obviously. We as Christians have set aside Sunday, and to some extent Wednesday also, as our day dedicated to worshiping God. Wednesday to a much lesser extent, but Sunday for sure. And in Hebrews 10:25, we have the same spirit of the fourth commandment when it tells us, "Not forsaking the assembling of ourselves together as the manner of some is, but exhorting one another, and so much the more as ye see the day approaching." So clearly a regular day dedicated to worshiping God is required in both the Old Testament and the New Testament. To avoid church is in fact a violation of the fourth commandment. So don't do it. Every Sunday you should be here, unless divinely separated from, such as disease and so forth. So the natural question then arises, what day? So this was the other question I gave you. First one was, does the Sabbath apply to us? Yes, it does. What day is it on? So this is the real question. Why do we in the New Testament worship on Sunday? And why did they in the Old Testament worship on Saturday? In the Old Testament law, it was clearly understood that the seventh day of the week was the Sabbath. The confusion really comes when we as Christians claim that Sunday is the new Sabbath, and everyone gets confused when someone asks for a reference for that claim. So basically this meme. Where do you see that in the New Testament? Can you give me chapter and verse where it says, oh, by the way, the Sabbath is now Sunday? I know some of you have looked this past week after I gave you that handout, and good, this is the point of the handout, is to really make you think about that. If I asked any of you for a specific chapter and verse that said, when is the Sabbath moved to Sunday? It would be very tough for a lot of you to give it to me. It was very tough for me to puzzle this out until I started studying it. But thankfully, we're going to have teaching on it today, and I've heard that Mark is going to teach a whole class or a series of classes on why we worship on Sunday. And hopefully this will be a good teaser for that class, if you will. So in fact, there are many cults out there, and they're growing in popularity, who overemphasize the importance of picking the correct day, and they use this issue to prove to mainstream Christianity that they're wrong by using Old Testament texts to say very clearly the Sabbath is on Saturday. And this has caused many to doubt, and many people who are very surface level who see this one issue and they say, oh no, abandon Christianity, let's go with the cult of whatever cult is of choice in this case. So to answer this question, we need to know why it was Saturday in the first place. Why in the Old Testament was it Saturday, and why is it now Sunday? by our argument. So Genesis 2, 1 through 3 is the origin of the Sabbath, and it says this: "Thus the heavens and the earth were finished, and all the hosts of them. And on the seventh day God ended his work which he had made, and he rested on the seventh day from all his work which he had made. And God blessed the seventh day and sanctified it, because that in it he had rested from all his work which God created and made." And I need to hurry. So with God as our example in all things moral and spiritual, he showed us by example that the seventh day, Saturday, was the day of rest. And at the time, it was actually not possible for it to be any other day. How would he rest before he did his labor? No, he had to rest at the end of his labor. So somewhat by default, but really by example, God picked the seventh day to rest on. And the key here is the example. So now if we looked at the New Testament, why do we worship on the Sunday instead of Saturday? I think it's interesting and important to note that there is no external start or endpoint to a week. All other time frames that we observe have objective standards set by the heavenly bodies, and this is scriptural. So Genesis 1:14 says, "And God said, let there be lights in the firmament of the heaven to divide the day from the night, and let them be for signs and for seasons and for days and years." So days, months, years, and seasons are all set by the motion of the planets and the stars and the moon and so forth. The week, however, is impossible to determine. If you were marooned on a desert island like a castaway and you had nothing but a volleyball to keep you company, you would never know what day of the week it was, assuming you had forgotten by the time you woke up on the beach. You would never know. But by careful observation of the stars and the sun and the seasons, you could know what day it was. You could get down to the very day. When you observe a solstice, you know it's one of the solstice days. And if you remember your calendar, you can then know the whole calendar from then. But that's not true about the week. If you had forgotten what day of the week was, you would never know. You would never be able to find out what day of the week it was. And that's interesting. And that's by design, in fact, I would say. The Sabbath is the only thing that gives us a 7-day week. And it's a good thing that we've kept the Sabbath, the 7-day week. There are some societies that have tried to go away from it, but they just don't stick. And that's because we, in our physical bodies, have been designed with a 7-day week in mind. And having more or less rest than that just doesn't work for us. So this kind of arbitrariness of the week leads us to the conclusion that we need some way to pick 7 days and what 7 days there are. And so thankfully, God picked it for us from the beginning, from his example in creation. So the Old Testament Sabbath was determined by the example of God resting on Saturday, which gives us the Saturday Sabbath by force of his example and really nothing else, which later became a command, but it started as just his example, which fits perfectly with our morality. God, as our example in all things moral, is our example in all things physical also. He rested on the Sabbath, therefore we must also. So then why does it come to the New Testament? Why does it turn to Sunday? For the same reasons. So let me read for you 1 Corinthians 16, 1 through 2. We see that by example in the New Testament of Jesus and the apostles, it moved to Sunday. So 1 Corinthians 16, 1 through 2 says, "Now concerning the collection for the saints, as I have given order to the churches of Galatia, even so do ye. Upon the first day of the week, let every one of you lay by him store, as God hath prospered him, that there be no gatherings when I come." So obviously this is speaking about tithes and offerings in the church. What does it say? The first day of the week, as a regular thing. Lay aside for the first day of the week, meaning when they're assembled in the church, this is when you're supposed to do this. So this is the example of the apostles. Acts 27 is similar. "And upon the first day of the week, when the disciples came together to break bread, Paul preached unto them, ready to depart on the morrow, and continued his speech until midnight." This is the story when that poor kid falls out of the window because Paul preached way too long. Never mind. So the point is, they were meeting on the first day of the week to worship in a church. John 20, verse 19 says, "Then the same day at evening, being the first day of the week, when the doors were shut, where the disciples were assembled for fear of the Jews, came Jesus and stood in the midst and said unto them, Peace be unto you." Aha, so now Jesus himself is assembling with the disciples the first day of the week, and this is Resurrection Sunday. This is the first example of Sunday of, you would say, I guess, Sunday worship in a church. This was the assembling of Jesus and the apostles on Sunday, Resurrection Sunday, where they worshiped God, and that was church. They definitely had church before that, but I couldn't find an earlier reference that specifically said on Sunday they were doing these things. But if you read the New Testament, if you read the Gospels, it sounds like Jesus was preaching and teaching all the time, every day. So that includes Sunday, obviously. In Revelation 1:10, we hear very explicitly that Sunday is called the Lord's Day. And historically, it was celebrated as such because it was the day Jesus rose from the dead. So let me read Revelation 1:10 to you. I was in the Spirit on the Lord's day and heard behind me a great voice as of a trumpet, and it goes on. So the point is, for the same reason the Sabbath was on Saturday in the Old Testament, which was the example given by God, resting after his creation, is the same reason that Sabbath is on Sunday in the New Testament, the example of Jesus rising from the dead and the regular worship of him by the apostles and by himself, in fact, on Sunday. So the example of God in the Old Testament gave us Saturday Sabbath. The example of Jesus in the New Testament gives us Sunday Sabbath. The same reason for the Old Testament Sabbath is the same reason for the New Testament Sabbath. Does that make sense to everyone? That's why it switched. It wasn't some arbitrary thing. It was a definitive thing. And it has the same force as the Old Testament commands. So let's look at a particular example that is sometimes mistakenly used to prove that Saturday is the proper day to worship. So this is from Acts 11:25 through 26. Then departed Barnabas to Tarsus for to seek Saul. And when he had found him, he brought him unto Antioch. And it came to pass that a whole year they assembled themselves with the church and taught much people, and the disciples were called Christians first in Antioch. So this kind of sets the context for the next verses. So if you skip down to Acts 13 through 15, it says this: Now when Paul and his company loosed from Paphos, they came to Pergia in Pamphylia, and John departing from them returned to Jerusalem. But when they had departed from Pergia, they came to Antioch in Pisidia, and went into the synagogue on the Sabbath day, and sat down. And after the reading of the law and the prophets, the rulers of the synagogue sent unto them, saying, Ye men and brethren, if ye have any word of exhortation for the people, say on. And then they go on to open the Old Testament and preach the gospel of Jesus from the Old Testament to these Jews on the Sabbath in the synagogue. So the argument here is, oh look, that was them going to church on Saturday, on the Jewish Saturday, Sabbath day. But that's not the case. The reason why I told you to read the early portion, 11:25 through 26, was that to show you that they were in a church on Sunday, and they had regular assembly. So the question is, how could you be in the temple on Sabbath and in the church on Sabbath preaching to two different people? And the answer is, you weren't. They were in the temple on the Jewish Sabbath on Saturday, but in church on Sunday for the Christian Sabbath. And this is a good proof text that says they were in two different places at two different times, talking to two different people, both regularly. So what were they doing? Paul and the other Christians were assembling regularly in Antioch, and they were also going to the synagogue to preach to the Jews, which is perfectly consistent with a evangelically focused church. They were going to the Jews who were supposed to be the ones who accepted Jesus first. They had thousands of years of history, tradition, law, and doctrine that were supposed to point them to Christ. So when Paul goes into the synagogue, he reads scripture to them that was supposed to point them to Christ, to get them out of Judaism, to convert them into Christianity. And then on the next day, on Sunday, he would go to church in the same city to different people and preach to them. So there's a distinction made between the two. He was preaching to the Christians on Sunday, on the Christian Sabbath, and to the Jews on Saturday, on the old Sabbath that was done away with or modified by Christ, I would say. Therefore, oops, I'm supposed to click through this. So there are your references. Therefore, having our worship on Sunday instead of Saturday also serves to highlight our next point, which is creating a distinction and identification for God's people. So if that was hopefully a little convincing to you, it'll be more convincing now. If we look at the third part of what the Sabbath really is, so what do I mean by this? Keeping the Sabbath holy and dedicated to God serves to make us distinct from the world and other religions and identifies us with God and with his people. So you'll see examples of this in the Old Testament with the Jews and the Gentiles. So for sake of time, I'm almost out of time. You can read these texts where they says that the Old Testament, it's a very consistent thing in the Old Testament and the New Testament, where God's people are supposed to be divided. You are not supposed to mingle in certain ways with lost sinners. So for us in the New Testament, there's a very clear example. You're not supposed to marry unbelievers. In the Old Testament, there was also that command, but a whole lot more. And I can't go into it, unfortunately, but these texts here, the important parts is they say, for it is a sign between me and you throughout your generations, that ye may know that I am the Lord that doth sanctify you, speaking of keeping the Sabbath. And also it says, it is a sign between me and the children of Israel forever. For in 6 days God made heaven and the earth. So he speaks again as the example from creation. Ezekiel 20 verse 12 says, moreover, also I gave them my Sabbaths, speaking about the Jews, to be a sign between me and them, that they might know that I am the Lord that sanctify them. So the Sabbath was always meant to distinguish God's people from unbelievers. And that is the same thing in the New Testament. So there's also an important verse here where Jewish proselytes and outcasts were identified with the Jews by the Sabbath keeping. So in Isaiah 56, 2 through 7 says this, blessed is the man that doeth this, and the son of man that layeth hold on it, that keepeth the Sabbath from polluting it, and keepeth his hand from doing any evil. Neither let the son of the stranger that hath joined himself to the Lord speak, saying, the Lord hath utterly separated me from his people. Neither let the eunuch say, behold, I am a dry tree. For thus saith the Lord unto the eunuchs that keep my Sabbaths, and choose the things that please me, and take hold on my covenant, even unto them will I give in mine house and within my walls a place and a name better than sons and daughters. I will give them an everlasting name that shall not be cut off. And the sons of the stranger that join themselves to the Lord to serve him, and to love the name of the Lord, to be his servants. Everyone that keepeth the Sabbath from polluting it, and taketh hold on my covenant, even them will I bring to my holy mountain, and make them joyful in my house of prayer. Their burnt offerings and their sacrifices shall be accepted unto mine altar, for mine house shall be called a house of prayer for all people. So importantly, the Sabbath explicitly stated, of all the commands, the Sabbath was explicitly stated, this will join you, it will identify you as one of my people. And it has the same force of that today in the New Testament. So Sunday worship in church has the same idea. In the New Testament, in modern times, the Sabbath, or Sunday worship for us, has the same effect. If you were to ask any lost person, what do Christians do? Probably the first thing they would say is they go to church on Sunday. If they don't say that, then they've probably not been around good Christians, and I hope it's not you that they're around. The opposite is also true. If you don't go to church regularly, you are not honoring the distinction that God intended for the Sabbath to have, and you're probably not being a good witness to them. If you're doing stuff on Sunday all the time, and your friends, they may never know that you're a Christian. That's like the number one thing. If you say, hey, it's Super Bowl Sunday, like I guess 2 weeks ago, it was Super Bowl Sunday. Where were you? I was at a Super Bowl party. Oh, I didn't think Christians did that. I thought Christians went to church on Sunday. Yes, they do. And yes, you should be here. And it's a good thing that you're all here. But if you're not here, you should be here. It is the key part of the Sabbath for us today. It is the most important part for us today by application, in fact. We have Saturday to rest. Thankfully, we have essentially 2 weekends. Rest on Saturday, be here on Sunday. It does both things of allowing you to properly worship God and fulfill all the other commandments. And it also has the effect of creating the distinction between you and the lost. So it also has the distinction of separating us from Judaism, from cults, and other religions. So, for example, Muslims, they worship on Friday. The Seventh-day Adventists obviously worship on Saturday. The Jews worship on Saturday. Christians are distinct from them because we worship on Sunday. There are plenty of other cults like the Black Hebrew Israelites and lots of Hebrew roots movements and other weird cults that worship on Saturday, and they make this distinction. They focus on this distinction. They say, we are not like the Christians, we are like the Jews, because we are Jews, for example, and they worship on Saturday. So your act of being here, worshiping on Sunday, is essentially evangelism of some form to show the world that you are a Christian, that you are identified as God's people. So if you're not here, you're not identifying with God's people. So I can't stress to you how important it is that you do worship on Sunday. And we're going to see later that the categories of the Ten Commandments fit well into the first 5 apply in the church very strongly. The last 5 apply in government very strongly. So if you're not in church, you essentially can't fulfill the 10 Commandments. The first 5, completely impossible to fulfill unless you are regularly assembling in church. So let's very quickly sum it up. What does this command teach us about God? He is our example in all things, even before there was sin. We touched on this. I can't go into it. He cares for our physical and our spiritual needs. These are not just spiritual commands, they are also physical applications. God says rest. He also says work. He wants a dedicated worship and a separation both of the day and separation of your labors from God's labors. He wants all that lumped in together as the Sabbath. What does this teach us about us? We should work. We should also rest. There needs to be a work and life balance. We need to dedicate time to serving God and be distinct from the lost, kind of by application. What does it teach us about good and evil? Sin can be unique to each individual. So I barely touched on this, but rest for some people is not rest for other people. For some people, hiking up a mountain is restful, and you're crazy. But for other people, just sitting in a hammock and resting is rest. It kind of is up to the individual in some ways. The point is that you must rest, and it must be restful for you. Sin and virtue have physical consequences. So if you're not resting, you will be overworked. You will be overtaxed. There are physical detriments to that. Also, if you're too lazy, you're resting all the time, there's physical consequences to that also. Sin is a rejection of our most basic physical nature and needs. If you're rejecting the idea of rest, you are rejecting Scripture, and you are rejecting your physical needs also. Sin has those components. And virtue should set us apart from the lost, very clearly. So applications, practical outcomes, regular corporate worship on Sunday. This is the most important. This is also the most flippant one. We don't treat this with the respect it needs. It's literally from the 10 Commandments. You must be in church on Sunday. Also, you must rest. If you can't rest on Sunday, then you got to rest on some other day, but you need both of these components. Together, they will give you a work-life balance. You will have a holy day dedicated to God, and there will be a distinction between God's people and the lost. So how do we do it? Rest for a day and go to church on Sunday, very simply. And I'm way over time. So if you have questions, you can talk to me after, but you're dismissed.